she bit back. That's the whole story, really. Except it isn't. Because what happened in that training pen on Veth Station didn't just change 3 alien cubs, it changed the way the entire galaxy thought about what it means to be a predator. And it started with a Tuesday. Commander Yara Osei had been assigned to the Veth Station Juvenile Predator Program for exactly 11 days when the incident occurred. She hadn't asked for the assignment. Nobody asked for the assignment. The VJJP, colloquially known among station staff as the Bite Lottery, was technically a diplomatic posting. The Veth were one of the most powerful species in the Conclave of Worlds, apex hunters, with a civilization built entirely around the philosophy that strength was the only language worth speaking. They had 17 words for dominance, 0 words for compromise. Their cubs, correspondingly, were absolute nightmares. Yara had the file. She'd read it 3 times on the transport over. Previous human trainers? 4. Average tenure? 9 days. Departure reasons, in order: 2 bite-related medical evacuations, 1 psychological withdrawal request, and 1 transfer that the official paperwork listed as voluntary, but which everyone on the station understood had followed a specific incident involving a cub named Vrak and a particularly unfortunate moment near the feeding enclosure. Nobody talked about Vrak. The file didn't explain what Vrak had done. Yara had decided not to ask. The cubs were 3 in number. Vrak, the oldest, biggest, and, according to the behavioral notes, the one most likely to establish early dominance hierarchies through physical testing. Yara had read that phrase 4 times. Each time it meant the same thing. Vrak bit people. Chell, mid-sized, faster than the behavioral sensors could consistently track, and noted as unpredictably exploratory in social boundary assessment. Chell also bit people, but creatively. And Keth, the smallest, who the file described with what Yara felt was almost criminal understatement as enthusiastically engaged in trainer interaction. Keth bit people the most. They were Veth, so they looked, roughly, like someone had taken a large cat, added a second set of forearms, given it eyes that could track independently in opposite directions, and then, crucially, given it the cognitive development of a highly intelligent 6-year-old who had been told their entire life that they were born to be the scariest thing in any room they entered. They were, objectively, magnificent. They were also, as Yara's predecessor's medical file documented in considerable detail, extremely bitey. She met them on a Tuesday. Vrak bit her within 40 seconds. Chell bit her 11 seconds after that. Keth, apparently feeling left out, bit her 30 seconds later. 3 bites, 91 seconds. New record for the program. Yara looked down at her arm, looked at the 3 cubs, looked back at her arm, and made a decision that no previous trainer had made, that the behavioral handbook specifically did not cover, that the station director would later describe in his incident report as, and this is a direct quote, not a protocol we had anticipated needing a protocol for. She bit Vrak back. What happened next was the beginning of everything. What happened next was also, and this matters, not what anyone expected.
Vrak froze. Not flinched. Not recoiled, not made a sound, froze. Every behavioral sensor in the training pen registered it simultaneously, the complete, total cessation of movement from the largest, most dominant juvenile Veth predator on the station. 47 kilograms of apex biology, suddenly as still as furniture. He had never frozen before. The behavioral file had no entry for it. Here's what you need to understand about Veth cubs. From the moment they are born, the world teaches them one lesson in 100 different ways. The one who does not flinch owns the room. Every interaction is a test. Every relationship is a hierarchy waiting to be established. When a Veth cub bites, it isn't cruelty, it isn't malice, it is a question. The only question their entire social architecture knows how to ask. What are you? Every previous trainer had answered the same way. Pain, withdrawal, retreat. all perfectly reasonable responses to being bitten by something with teeth engineered over millions of years of predator evolution. All answers the cubs already knew, all answers that confirmed exactly what the cubs suspected. Yara had given a different answer. She hadn't bitten hard. She was clear about that later, in the debrief, when the station director sat across from her with an expression she could only describe as a man trying very hard not to have the reaction he was having. "I didn't break skin," she said. He paused. "That's noted. It was more of a firm pressure communication." "Right. Veth cubs establish hierarchy through physical assertion. The file confirmed it. I asserted." The director looked at her for a long moment. "With your teeth." "With my teeth," Yara agreed. Back in the training pen, in the 11 seconds after the bite, 3 things happened in sequence. First, Vrak stayed frozen, processing something his entire nervous system had no existing framework for. A prey animal that bit back, not fleeing, not attacking, just responding, in kind, calmly, like it was a completely normal thing to do. Second, Chell, who had been watching from the far corner of the enclosure with the focused attention of a scientist observing a particularly interesting experiment, made a sound, small, involuntary, somewhere between a chirp and a question. Third, Keth sat down, just sat down, mid-enclosure, on his haunches, and stared at Yara with the 4 independently tracking eyes of a creature whose entire worldview had just been handed a piece of information it didn't know what to do with. The training pen was very quiet. Yara held Vrak's gaze. This mattered. She knew it mattered. Every instinct she had, human instinct built over 200,000 years of social evolution, told her that this was the moment, the hinge point, the breath between question and answer. She didn't look away. She didn't smile. Smiling, she'd learned in the pre-deployment cultural briefing, showed teeth in a way the Veth read as active threat display. She'd filed that information away carefully. She kept her face neutral. Her heart rate, she noted somewhere in the calm, analytical corner of her brain that operated independently of the rest of her, was absolutely through the roof. Externally, completely still. Vrak made a sound she'd never heard before. Low, resonant, not aggressive. The aggressive vocalizations were documented and she'd memorized them. Not submissive either. Something else. Something the behavioral file, which she was rapidly losing faith in as a comprehensive document, had no entry for. She found out later from the Veth cultural liaison what the sound meant. It translated roughly as, "I need to think about this." From a Veth cub, this was, and the liaison had paused here, choosing her words with the care of delivering genuinely significant news, essentially unprecedented. Veth cubs did not think about things. Veth cubs decided about things, instantly, instinctively, decisively. Thinking, the act of pausing, of holding a conclusion in suspension, of admitting that new information required new processing, was not a juvenile Veth behavior. It was an adult one. Yara had been in the pen for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. She had been bitten 3 times, bitten back once, and apparently accidentally triggered the first recorded instance of juvenile Veth metacognitive processing in the station's 11-year history. She still had 43 minutes left in the session. Chell moved, not toward her, laterally. The slow, precise lateral movement the file described as pre-engagement repositioning, which Yara had learned meant exactly what it sounded like. Chell was not done asking questions. She just preferred to ask them from a different angle.
Chell was smarter than the file suggested. That was the first thing Yara understood in the 7 seconds between Chell beginning her lateral repositioning and Chell completing it. The behavioral notes described her as unpredictably exploratory, which Yara now recognized as the clinical language of someone who had been outsmarted by a juvenile alien predator and needed a way to write that down professionally. Chell wasn't unpredictable. Chell was strategic. She had moved to Yara's left side. Specifically, and this is the part that the station's behavioral AI flagged as statistically significant when it reviewed the sensor logs later, she had moved to the side where Yara's bite had landed on Vrak. She was examining the interaction site. Not Vrak, not Yara. The location of the exchange, as if the space itself contained information. In 11 years of juvenile Veth behavioral data, no cub had ever done this. The AI flagged it as an anomaly. Yara, watching Chell's 4 eyes track independently across the enclosure floor with the focused intensity of a forensic investigator, flagged it as something else entirely. She's collecting evidence. Keth was still sitting. This, Yara would later learn, was the most alarming thing in the room. Keth did not sit. Keth's entire behavioral profile was built around constant motion. The file described him as kinetically persistent, which was, again, professional language for a creature that never stopped moving, ever, under any circumstances, and had once disassembled a reinforced feeding station during what was supposed to be a routine enrichment exercise, purely because it was there and disassemblable. Keth sitting still meant Keth was thinking. 2 cubs thinking simultaneously. The training pen had never had this problem before. Yara did what every good trainer learns to do in the gap between one crisis and the next. She waited. She stood in the center of the enclosure, equidistant from all 3 cubs, which was either tactically sound or the behavioral equivalent of standing in the middle of a triangle and daring the geometry, and she waited with the specific quality of stillness that her first mentor had described as expensive patience. Not passive, not frozen, present, available, letting the space fill with whatever the cubs needed to put in it. This was, as she would later explain to the director, basic juvenile predator psychology. He would write that down. Vrak moved first. He approached slowly. This alone was documented territory. The file had entries for slow approach. But the slow approach in the file was a hunting behavior, weight forward, center low, the geometry of something preparing to close distance suddenly. This wasn't that. Vrak's weight was back, slightly. His spine was straight rather than coiled. His secondary forearms, the smaller pair, which Veth used primarily for fine manipulation and, according to the cultural liaison, for what translated roughly as careful handling of things that matter, were extended slightly forward. Yara had never seen a cub extend secondary forearms. The file had no entry for it. She stayed still. He stopped directly in front of her. They were close enough that she could see the fine bioluminescent patterns along his jaw, faint blue-gold tracery that the Veth cultural notes described as lineage markings, present from birth, unique to each individual like a fingerprint. Up close, they were extraordinary, like something between circuitry and constellation. She had been too busy not getting mauled to notice them before. Vrak looked at her. She looked back. He extended one secondary forearm and touched her arm, precisely where he had bitten. Gently, with the careful, deliberate pressure of something making a point rather than an injury. Then he made the sound again. I need to think about this. Behind him, Chell had finished her forensic examination of the floor and was now watching with the contained intensity of someone waiting for a conclusion they already suspected. Her secondary forearms were folded. The cultural notes said this was a posture of engaged attention without active intent, watching without hunting. Keth had not moved. Keth was still sitting, still thinking. The station behavioral AI was generating flags faster than the monitoring team could clear them. Yara made a decision. Slow, deliberate, telegraphed so far in advance that there could be no ambiguity about intent. She raised her own hand and touched Vrak's forearm, precisely where she had bitten him. Same pressure, same duration, same point. He didn't freeze this time. He made a third sound she didn't have a translation for, shorter, sharper, with a harmonic overtone that resonated at a frequency she felt more than heard, and stepped back. Looked at her for a long moment, then sat down. 3 Veth cubs, all sitting, all looking at her. The training pen was so quiet Yara could hear the atmospheric recyclers in the ceiling. She had 31 minutes left in the session and absolutely no idea what she just started.
The station director watched the sensor replay 4 times. Then he called the Veth cultural liaison. Then he called the conclave Xenobehavioral Division. Then he sat in his office for a while, looking at his wall, doing the specific kind of thinking that happens when something has occurred that is simultaneously wonderful and deeply outside your professional preparation. His name was Director Fenwick. He had run Veth Station for 9 years. He had overseen the juvenile predator program through 6 human trainers, 23 behavioral incidents, 2 diplomatic complaints from the Veth Homeworld Council, and 1 situation involving Vrak and the feeding enclosure that he had personally agreed never to document. He had never seen 3 Veth cubs sit voluntarily. Not once. Not for anyone. The cultural liaison's name was Sava. She was Charathi, a species who had coexisted with the Veth for 3 centuries and had therefore developed what she described as a very calibrated relationship with controlled terror. She knew more about Veth behavioral psychology than anyone else on the station, and possibly more than most people on the Veth homeworld, where such knowledge was considered less academic study and more basic survival. Fenwick showed her the replay. She watched it once. Then she watched the moment of the bite back. Then she watched the 3 cubs sit down. She turned to Fenwick with an expression he had never seen on her face in 9 years. "She passed," Sava said. "Passed what?" Sava looked at him with the patience of someone explaining something to a person who should already understand it. "The first test," Sava said. "The only test that matters to a Veth cub. The question they ask every new presence in their space." She paused. "Your previous trainers all answered it the same way. And Osei answered it differently." Osei answered it correctly. Sava looked back at the replay. The bite back wasn't aggression. The cubs would have recognized aggression. They know aggression. It wasn't submission either. It was... She searched for the word. It was reciprocity. She spoke their language, not fluently, not perfectly, but she spoke it. Fenwick looked at the frozen image on the screen. 3 cubs sitting, 1 human standing. "What does it mean," he asked, "that they're sitting?" Sava was quiet for a moment. "In adult Veth," she said carefully, "voluntary sitting in the presence of another individual is a posture of counsel, of equals meeting to exchange information of mutual value." She paused again. "Cubs don't do it. Their social development doesn't reach that stage for years. The sitting posture requires a level of cognitive..." She stopped. Started again. "Your trainer didn't just pass the test," Sava said. "She accelerated their development by approximately 3 to 4 years." The recyclers hummed in the silence. "In 47 minutes?" Fenwick said. "In 47 minutes," Sava confirmed. Back in the training pen, Yara had no idea any of this was happening. She was sitting on the floor. This had been a practical decision. Standing for 47 minutes while 3 alien predators processed an existential recalibration was hard on the knees. But it had also, she would discover later, communicated something significant. Sitting voluntarily, at their level, in their space. Vrak had noticed immediately. He had moved, slowly, with the telegraphed deliberateness he'd been using since the moment she bit him back, and sat closer. Not touching distance, not quite. The precise distance, she would later learn, that adult Veth maintained during what their culture called a first council. Close enough to engage, far enough to leave. The distance of equals who hadn't yet decided how equal they were. Chell had done something extraordinary. She had brought Yara something. It was a piece of enrichment equipment, a dense polymer block the training staff put in the enclosure for the cubs to disassemble, part of the cognitive stimulation program. Chell had carried it across the enclosure in her secondary forearms, careful handling of things that matter, and placed it on the floor between herself and Yara. Then she sat back and looked at it, then at Yara, then at it. The universal body language of, "Your turn." Yara had picked it up, examined it with visible interest, turned it over, found the seam where the components locked together, and pressed it experimentally. Chell made a sound of, there was no other way to describe it, approval. Keth had fallen asleep. This was, Sava would explain later, also significant. Sleeping in the presence of an unestablished contact was a profound vulnerability display for a Veth. Their survival instincts ran so deep that juvenile Veth almost never entered full sleep cycles outside of their secure den spaces. Keth had curled up 3 meters from Yara and gone completely, deeply, trustingly asleep. The behavioral AI had flagged this as its highest priority anomaly of the session. Yara had watched him for a moment, soft and small and breathing slowly, bioluminescent markings pulsing gently in some dream rhythm she had no framework for, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Something that had nothing to do with training protocols or behavioral files or diplomatic postings. She came back the next day. Nobody had asked her to. The session was complete. The program schedule had a rest day built in, partially for the cubs, mostly historically for the trainers to recover from whatever the cubs had done to them. She came back anyway. She sat outside the enclosure for 20 minutes before the staff realized she was there. Inside the pen, Vrak had been sitting at the enclosure barrier since approximately the time her shift would normally begin, waiting. Fennec watched this on the monitor feed and said nothing for a long time. Then he called the Veth Homeworld Council, because what was happening in that training pen was no longer a behavioral program. It was something the Veth had a word for, one of the 17 words for dominance, except this one wasn't about dominance at all, and had been mistranslated as such for 300 years of conclave records. The correct translation, Sava had been trying to get corrected in the official documents since her second year on the station, was not dominance, it was chosen family.
The Veth Homeworld Council sent a delegation. This had never happened before. Not for a training program, not for a diplomatic incident, not for anything occurring on Veth Station that didn't involve either a formal treaty negotiation or an active military situation. The Council of Elders, 7 individuals who between them represented 11 million years of recorded Veth civilization, did not dispatch themselves to outer stations for behavioral anomalies. They dispatched themselves for one reason only: a claim of Verith. Sava explained it to Yara the morning the delegation was due to arrive, in the station's small briefing room, with the careful, measured cadence of someone delivering information they wanted to make absolutely certain landed correctly. Verith, Sava said, is the oldest concept in Veth culture, older than their written language, older than their space travel, older than the conclave itself. She paused. It is the recognition of a bond that transcends species, transcends hierarchy. A bond formed not through blood or treaty or obligation, but through the specific act of being seen, truly seen, by something that had no reason to see you and chose to anyway. Yara was quiet for a moment. The cubs filed a claim, she said. Cubs cannot file claims, Sava said. They lack the cognitive and legal standing. Another pause. Vrak's brother filed it on their behalf, based on their testimony. Their testimony? Veth cubs can communicate complex experiential accounts to their parents from approximately age 2 onward. The mothers assess the account and determine whether it warrants formal recognition. Sava looked at Yara steadily. Vrak's mother heard his account of what happened in that pen. Then she heard Chell's. Then Keth's. She folded her hands. Then she contacted the council. Yara sat with that for a moment. What exactly did they say happened? Sava smiled, the small, precise smile of someone who had been waiting to deliver a specific piece of information for several days. Vrak said you answered his question, she said. Chell said you taught her something no one had taught her before. And Keth, the smile became something warmer, Keth said you were safe to sleep near.
The delegation arrived at 0900. 7 Veth elders, full ceremonial presence, which meant, among other things, that they arrived in the formal hunting configuration, a diamond formation that had not been used in diplomatic contexts for 200 years because the last species that encountered it filed a formal complaint describing it as aggressively intentional. It was aggressively intentional. That was the point. They were not here to negotiate, they were here to witness. Yara met them in the training pen. This had been her suggestion, delivered to Fennec with the calm certainty of someone who had spent 3 weeks sitting on the floor of an alien predator enclosure and had recalibrated accordingly. Fennec had started to explain 17 reasons why that was diplomatically irregular. She had listened to 4 of them before he'd trailed off, looked at the monitor feed showing Vrak sitting at the barrier again, and simply nodded. The pen was the right place. Everyone understood that. The cubs were already inside when the elders entered. Vrak, Chell, and Keth had been brought in at 0830. Normal session time, normal routine. Yara had been adamant about that. Nothing ceremonial, nothing performed, just the session. Vrak had been sitting at the barrier since 0743. What happened in the next 20 minutes would be transcribed, analyzed, and referenced in conclave xenocultural documents for the next 2 centuries. Yara walked in. The cubs moved toward her. Not the hunting approach, not the testing approach, but the third kind of movement that the behavioral file had no entry for, because no previous trainer had ever been present long enough to see it. The approach of animals moving towards something they have decided is theirs to protect. She sat down. All 3 sat with her, Vrak on her left, Chell on her right, Keth, inevitably, magnificently, with the complete absence of self-consciousness that had characterized every single thing he had ever done, directly in her lap. She put her hand on his back. He made the sound, the one she still didn't have a full translation for, the short, sharp harmonic that she felt more than heard. She had asked Sava about it the previous week. Sava was quiet for a long moment before answering. "There isn't a clean translation," she said. "The closest the linguistic database gets is approximately," another pause, "mine, in the specific sense of this person belongs to my world, and my world is better for having them in it." The eldest of the 7 council members, a Veth of such profound age that her bioluminescent markings had shifted from blue-gold to a deep silver that seemed to generate its own light, stood at the enclosure entrance and watched. She watched Vrak lean against Yara's shoulder with the unconscious ease of something that had been doing this for years rather than weeks. She watched Chell place the polymer block between them and wait with patient intelligence for the game they'd apparently been playing every session since the 2nd day. She watched Keth sleep. She watched Yara, this human, this small, soft creature from a death world that the galaxy had spent centuries underestimating, sit in the center of it all with the absolute, unperformed ease of someone who was exactly where they were supposed to be. The elder made a sound. Low, resonant, ancient in a way that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than language. The other 6 elders echoed it. Sava, standing beside Fennec at the observation window, translated without being asked. Her voice was very quiet. "It means the claim is witnessed. The bond is real." Fennec did nothing. The elder walked to the enclosure barrier, slowly, with the enormous, deliberate weight of someone performing an act they had not performed in their lifetime, but whose meaning they carried in the oldest part of their bones. She extended her secondary forearms, both of them, palms open, markings visible. The gesture, Sava would explain afterward, had not been recorded in formal diplomatic context since the founding treaty of the conclave itself. It was the gesture the first Veth elder made to the first non-Veth species they had ever recognized as worth recognizing. It meant, you are seen, you are known, you are no longer outside. Yara looked at the elder across the enclosure. Keth shifted in her lap, chasing something through whatever Veth cubs dreamed about. She thought about 11 days, about a behavioral file that hadn't prepared her for any of this, about 47 minutes on a Tuesday, about a decision that the handbook hadn't covered and that she made anyway because it was the honest answer to an honest question. What are you? She looked at Vrak against her shoulder, Chell waiting with the block, Keth breathing slowly. She looked at the elders' open hands. She extended her own. The formal recognition of Verith between Yara Osei and the cubs Vrak, Chell, and Keth was ratified by the Conclave of Worlds 14 months later, the first such recognition between a human and a Veth in recorded history. The diplomatic implications took years to fully unfold. The cubs grew. They grew large and fierce and extraordinary in the way that Veth do, but they never bit another trainer. Not because they were disciplined into restraint, not because they were afraid of the consequence, because Vrak had answered the question for them in the particular way that elder siblings answer questions for younger ones. Not with words, but with demonstration. When a new trainer entered the pen for the first time, nervous and file prepared and ready for the bite, Vrak would position himself between the trainer and his siblings and make a sound, the sound that meant, "I need to think about this," and he would sit and wait and give the trainer time to answer. When Yara was asked later, in an interview that became one of the most watched broadcasts in Conclave history, what she was thinking in the moment she bit Vrak back, she was quiet for a while. "I wasn't thinking," she said finally. "Not strategically, not diplomatically." She paused. "He asked me a question. I answered it honestly." The interviewer asked what the question was. She smiled. "The same question everyone asks, when they don't have the words for it yet." A pause. "Are you real?" Another pause. "I just told him yes."